All right, just confirming audio visual, all good?
Yep.
Great. New democracies are usually born in the immediate aftermath of some sort of conflict against whatever the previous, presumably autocratic regime was. And that is an incredibly delicate position to be in. It often takes and often requires a coalition that is composed of radically different ideologies, often incredibly extreme ones that are born under the pressure of extreme forms of repression and deprivation. And that means that the choices available to you in the immediate aftermath of that conflict around the ideologies that you could politically reasonably center your identity around is a choice between a basket of extremist, a basket of narrow and often unflexible ways of viewing the world. Compare that to the way in which you are able to choose different national icons on side government and the way that we think states are likely to and have empirically done so. It is easy to do things like choose multiple national icons. You cannot do that with ideology. You must choose one because it is necessarily in conflict with all of the others around it. You cannot be both a capitalist and a communist state. You have to choose. But you can have leaders of different types of ideological movements be crafted into icons. You can easily flatten over the radical nature of their politics in the way that Americans flatten over the radical nature of MLK and of Malcolm X's politics all the time. And we say on side government that that is a useful and incredibly productive instrument that drives unity in a post-conflict state, that gives people a way of rallying around the personal goods and traits of these leaders and gives them a reason to trust the new state, to think it is legitimate, to engage with it in a way that is productive. So firstly, on unification, the first thing we would note is that in this aftermath, you have a coalition of different ideological groups that have helped to deliver you the victory that you have finally attained. And you cannot just do away with their support immediately without that country being likely to descend back into conflict again, which means that you need to be able to do forms of bargaining and to do forms of coalition building with those types of factions and with those groups as well. And that means that it is incredibly instrumentally useful on side government, that you're able to do things like explain how you'd be able to teach the story of their leader, to elevate those individual leaders that are in the room with you as you have those conversations around building the state, building things like a national curriculum and trying to construct a post-conflict identity that throws off things like colonial identities and colonial cultures. That's extraordinarily useful as a bargaining chip that helps these new governments maintain a level of unity and a level of stability. And that is extraordinarily important on side government. And it is something that is, I think, clearly mutually exclusive. I would point towards things like the ideas like the way in which you're able to create figures like the way that India did in the immediate aftermath of colonization. You have figures as ideologically diverse as Gandhi and as Nehru, and you're able to value them for different reasons that are inherently not mutually exclusive. For instance, you value Nehru as being a pragmatist and a diplomat. You value Gandhi as being an idealist, as somebody who supported peace. Obviously, that's extraordinarily reductive, but there are things that different people from different areas of the country who have different reasons and ways of relating to those diverse figures can get behind and can be supported in. That's extremely useful because you're able to use this to not only appeal to different ideological groups, but you're also able to use it to appeal to different ethnic identities, religious identities, geographical identities in a way that does drive unity and in a way that does create a perception that those different values are ones that are represented in the new state and ones that that new government cares about. And the important thing that we would say on side government is that that means that people are more likely to be trusting of a brand new state, more likely to engage with that democracy and to think that it's positive. And in particular, they're more likely to have a positive view of the party that is in the initial lead and that takes the lead on the way that these different narratives are crafted as well. Comparing that to ideology, which is necessarily far more exclusionary, which is necessarily far more likely to alienate members of that winning coalition and to drive future conflict or future political conflict or instability. That is something that we think is incredibly bad. These short-term benefits are ones that you should weigh highly in this debate. The most dangerous time for new democracies is, I would say, the immediate 5 to 10 years after they are founded, when the conditions are ripe for future conflict, when groups have just come out of a conflict, are still armed, are still organized, maintain their networks, and maintain their motivation. population, that is the point in which you most need to care about having a way of pacifying those groups. That is incredibly useful. And I would just note that I think people identify more powerfully with individual figures, especially ones that lead these different movements or these different factions, than they do with ideology. And I would point towards things like the way that Sheikh Hasina has been able to use the murder of her family in the early stages of Bangladeshi democracy to entrench her own political party. That is a good thing because it ensured that there was 70 years of stability in Bangladesh that allowed it to develop in a way that was far more productive than the countries around it, like Pakistan as well. And that is as a function of that relatively moderate politics that that party was able to at the time use. It's a function of stability and having a consistent and predictable vision that meant that multinational corporations and foreign governments could rely on that party to govern that country effectively, something that is only possible when identity is centered around individuals, that is more unifying, that is more likely to get consistent and stable states. It's incredibly powerful and incredibly important. Now, I suppose you might be thinking, but isn't it kind of bad that democracy in that type of state is not very good? But we would say it's a very fine and acceptable trade-off. There's a long period in which, in the immediate birth of a new democracy, it is good and fine that there is a level of autocracy that occurs and that there is a relatively reduced amount of political competition, because that allows consistency, that allows the development of economic growth, something that is far better for the people on the ground and far more important to them than relatively more notional ideas of whether their ideology is represented and not, but also something that allows those states to develop a civic society, to have a functional society that is able to hold power over that government and hold it to account in future. Yeah, I'll take that POI from closing.
You can't just say we can whitewash heroes, but we can't whitewash ideologies. We won't choose something oppositional like communism or socialism. It's probably like life, liberty, happiness. We can have multiple ones. It's all good.
Okay, I guess you guys don't really want to have a real debate. That's fair enough. We will at opening government, though. And the important thing to say here, though, is just that even those ideologies are ones that are easy to polarize. For instance, I would point to the centering of the Chinese state around the idea of communism, made it much, much harder for Deng Xiaoping to be able to engage in the types of liberalization that he wanted and needed to engage in order to drive economic growth in that country. The ideologies that are born of conflict are not ones that are very suitable for governing in peace. They are rarely ones that are suitable for having relationships with the hegemons in the region because they are necessarily extreme and oppositional. And even the perception of identity as being shaped around them is bad. But it also leads to downstream harms. For instance, the statist backlash against those liberalizing reforms that occurred in China is in major part because of the fact that so much of that state's identity was centered around communism, that filtered down to the young people, it filtered down to the population, and meant that people were unwilling to accept the pragmatic and the necessary reforms that were done because they came because they conflicted with that ideology. Compare that to the flexibility and responsiveness that has been able to be done in places like India, that has allowed it to respond to changing geopolitical circumstances, to engage in reforms when necessary, to walk back those reforms when necessary as well. We on side government create a state that is more unified, more supported by the population, far less radical, and far more able to respond to things like the needs of countries like the United States or other regional centers who want to work with these new governments, but need to trust that they will not be ideologically opposed to them and to their companies. For those reasons, proud to govern.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for that fine speech. I now welcome the Leader of Opposition, Sophia.
Hello, can I just verify if I'm visible and audible?
Yep, you are.
All right, thank you so much. I'll set up my timer. I prefer POIs raised verbally, so just feel free to unmute. Just don't badger. Thank you. All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Leaders die and are full of problems, while ideas live forever and can be agreed upon. Hence, it's incredibly important for us to stand for ideas. We are operating this debate in a new democracy. So let's unpack what exactly that means. This is a democracy that is newly formed that we agree came post-conflict. And because of that, it's lacking a sense of national identity. It's still forming things that it needs to be able to function over time and be sustainable. Things like systems, things like a government, things like a constitution. These things haven't been set yet. These new democracies also face issues, things like challenges to authority, the risk of coups, because there are different groups that are competing that would want to be in power or would want things to be their way. Ultimately, the goal of this debate is to be able to keep the peace. We want to be able to keep the peace because we don't have the capacity to put down revolution, right? And we believe that the best way that we can possibly do that is to center our state and its ideals on an idea as opposed to a single person or a couple of leaders. We think that that's much better. We need a way to be able to create stability in the nation that is much more urgent. And we'll explain how exactly we're able to do that. So what exactly is the problem that exists? So yeah, we'll discuss stability. But before I go into that, just a couple of responses for the previous speaker. So what exactly did the previous speaker tell us? The previous speaker told us that we can find leaders that represent most people, and therefore most people will probably be happy and satisfied with like how we're representing them, and everything's gonna be okay. Somehow that's going to pacify them. We think that first and foremost, it's just incredibly unrealistic and hard to get multiple people to rally around the leaders that you choose. The reason for that being that the leaders that probably exist are people only from the majority group, right? The group that is in power, whoever led the conflict to begin with, right? There's not an unlimited set of leaders. There's no such thing like as a conflict or like as a state wherein like every single group is represented by a leader, right? That's not necessarily true. What's likely true is that they are choosing people from the majority group. And ultimately, we think that that is wrong insofar as they are post-conflict. They're like it's very fresh in their minds, the atrocities that have occurred during this conflict. And as a result of that, when they pick a leader, they're going to easily recall the harms that this leader has committed, especially during the conflict, and because of that, likely be angered. Because this is probably the leader who decided to maybe ravage their village or like sack their or like sack their belongings and things like that. So ultimately, we think that the fact that it's very fresh in people's minds and the fact that it's unlikely that everyone can be represented, we think that it's just going to be incredibly difficult to get the benefit that the other side wants of representation. So before I continue, I'll take the POI.
Yep, so this motion allows opening government side to have fiat, which means that I wasn't describing a plausible way in which this would occur, but I was describing how we would choose leaders. We would deliberately choose them to represent multiple different groups and make sure that that was done in a way that would represent people and ensure that that was used as a bargaining tool to maintain peace. So can you respond to how the motion works?
You can attempt to do that, but you can't fiat that you're going to be able to do it successfully. We are telling you that these people that you would try to pick are probably not going to exist, right? And we think that that's believable. Okay, but now let's go on to the argument on stability, right? So what exactly is the problem on the other side, right? The problem on the other side is that like even if they're able to choose leaders, right, it's probably going to lead to a lot of instability. So like this is even in their best case that they are able to choose representative leaders, right? An important fact to consider is that leaders are human and have done a lot of wrong. Inherently, people in their lives commit wrongs and make mistakes all the time. People couldn't have had perfect knowledge or perfect empathy, especially growing up, right? Ultimately, because of this, they have probably mistreated certain people. They've probably made bad choices, and also because of the lack of information that they probably had during the conflict, they probably made decisions that led to a lot of casualties, like leading soldiers to their deaths. Ultimately, we think that because of this, a lot of people do feel a sense of resentment or do feel a sense of or like a sense of distrust towards the fact that these leaders were chosen, given the fact that they have made a lot of mistakes over time. Apart from that, also just inherently, people belong from certain groups and have more bias towards certain groups, or people have more biases towards certain behaviors and towards just like certain religions and traits and so on and so forth. It's impossible for a single person to be part of every single group in a nation. It's impossible for a single person to not be biased at all and to like appeal to every single person. And ultimately, as a result of this, people are probably not going to be like more distrusting towards like whoever is whoever was chosen. Ultimately, the harm is simple. People wronged by the leader will probably be angered and feel disenfranchised by whoever leader is chosen. And we think that's unfortunate if the other side wants to promote unity and inclusion, right? Apart from that, secondly, leaders are just unclear guidelines to mold a nation after, right? It's very hard to look at one's life and determine what to make out of it, especially when establishing a nation. So we, like, for example, like we're establishing a nation and we choose like this guy to represent us, and then what does that mean, right? It's very hard to like tell people like what exactly that entails. At the end of the day, what they're probably going to do, as like especially when guiding policy, is having to draw out principle from this leader's life, right? To draw out principle or ideas that we have to collectivize over from this person's life. So for example, maybe if a leader was very fair, then we ought to say that, oh, because of this, we stand for fairness as a nation, we stand for democracy. But then that just takes away from the other side of the house, right? Because that just turns their side of the house into our side, which is much more direct, and that's probably better because we don't have to fight with each other over what exactly a leader's life means. We actually identify what exact principles we're talking about and reduce the level of conflict that we have to go through in order to agree upon certain principles that we stand for. So ultimately, why are we better then? On our side of the house, it's just more clear and more possible to choose ideology much more easily than a leader to represent the nation. It's less contentious and confusing, right? Because right from the get-go, you establish what exactly your nation stands for. I think that is incredibly important when establishing a nation, because you're writing important documents such as the Constitution, right? You're creating the systems such as how exactly people vote, how exactly people like how exactly society is supposed to operate, what exact accountability measures have to be in place, and that should all be guided by certain ideals that the nation has, right? And you can't just do that from a leader, which is contentious and confusing. What do you draw out from a leader's life, right? Again, what you draw out is principle, and that's exactly what we make clear right from the get-go on our side of the house, reducing conflict at the end of the day. So ultimately, if you believe in stability, if you believe in the nation actually succeeding, then you ought to side up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leader of Opposition, for that fine speech. I now welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Unfortunately for this opposition bench, the simple truth of this debate is that a principle is not an ideology. Fairness is not an ideology in the same way that a well put together, consistent philosophical or ideological position such as communism or capitalism is, with decades of study behind them, with substantial amounts of political thought put in, with implementations into specific political structures and the way a government functions. Fairness is a guiding principle, and I think that means that definitionally speaking, the sorts of lines this opposition bench seems to want to run in this debate just do fall out of the debate. But even if you do buy the fact that they get to claim, they can claim certain very hard, very firm principles forever, the first contribution I'm going to make in this deputy speech is just to explain why those forms firm and selected ideologies are fundamentally worse for the operation of the nation than aligning yourself with a specific individual. And that is just for the reason that that individual has far more scope to be flexible about the ways in which they govern the nation, to choose the specific guiding path that is most suitable for that nation at that point in time. And the simple analysis we would give to explain here is that where ideology is something which is perfect, must necessarily always stay the same and stay ideologically consistent, we would observe that when an individual is elected, is appointed into a position of power, that individual is instead elected on the mandate of bringing what is best for the people. They're often elected on the mandate of their personal character, their ability to unify disparate groups in the wake of a revolution, as Jordyn so eloquently explains to you. And I think what that means for this debate is that our team uniquely gets to present you a leader with a relatively substantial amount of flexibility. They get to do things like collaborate with other significant leaders during the revolution. They get the ability to even move away from their principles by explaining to the public that times have changed and it is now time to do something new. And uniquely, the power of that leader is they have all the capital in the eyes of the people. They have the ability to guide this nascent democracy into taking the motions it needs to, while the opposition bench relies on a single targeted ideology, sticks to it, and renders that country completely concrete and flexible. The best response to this material from Offbench so far is really weirdly the COPOI, which is just to say that we can claim things like, freedom is an ideology we want to defend. The first observation I would make is that this ideology is literally meaningless. Like, what on earth does this even mean? It is so difficult to set up a coherent message about how you want the country to look like. Contrast this to specific political figures who can at least articulate the sorts of directions and goals a country might want to have, can put forward specific policy to be debated on the floor, can organize with one another. We think clearly individuals is a far preferable alternative in explaining why it is the case that this nation should move in the way it ought. I think clearly then our team is the one that does get substantially better governance right from the outset, even if we can claim none of the democratic or unification claims as side opening opposition would like to make it out. And as Jordyn explains, this in and of itself is debate winning, because note that the difference between a state immediately at the point at which it becomes a nascent democracy and a state right before that point is actually not very different, right? This is obviously still a place which is relatively in need of some modes of intervention to improve the living quality of the people within that nation, as side opening opposition themselves concedes. We point out to you that insofar as our team structurally has far better modes of governance because we allow our leaders those forms of flexibility, that ultimately is a substantially better thing. Before moving on to explain and defend our contributions at PM, closing.
If some ideologies are meaningless, some heroes are meaningless. What does Gandhi really embody except non-violence, which we could just say outright?
Non-violence is a great moral value to take, and that is actually our point, right? Like, our whole claim here in this argument is just to say that we do not need to militantly adhere to all of Gandhi's ideals, especially not the more controversial ones. We get to pick and choose specific aspects of that character we prefer. We get to sell a nation on the idea that Gandhi knows what is best for them, and we get the flexibility to allow that nation to choose the way it ought to develop in a way that side opposition never can. That is a clear win for opening government. The second thing I just want to explain, though, is to just analyze why exactly we do get substantially better amounts of unity under our side of the House, which is the main point of contention from opening opposition. The first thing, as Jordyn explains to you in response to a POI, is just the fact that this is a debate where we have fear, and we analyze the reasons to you why it would particularly be possible to choose a set of national figures in the way we describe. For example, the fact that because this is a nascent democracy, the set of individuals currently holding power are most likely a coalition of relatively disparate groups. And yes, obviously those disparate groups might engage in some modes of infighting, but right now they're incredibly unified. They have all worked together in order to win that civil war or revolution. They are probably all relatively close working partners. We think this is a uniquely good circumstance to allow for the selection of unified perspectives. Let's just be really comparative here, right? Like, think about if this country had to choose a specific ideology with a coherent political mission. In that scenario, where each of those individuals thinks of incentives not in terms of them wanting to be valorized for some virtue they have, but rather in the promotion of their own ideology, that is obviously a discussion forum far more fraught with the sorts of tensions that this opening opposition team would so desperately want to avoid. The claim that we hear is that maybe it is the case that these individuals just would not want to work together for the reason that they could be ideologically different. A few responses to this. The first is just the fact that what unifies all of these figures is obviously the fact that they do authentically want a better country and have previously fought and worked together to do so, which indicates that it is incredibly likely we get a successful set of leadership and icons under our side of the House. But the second observation we would just make is that this is inherently true in the way that different countries around the world have weaponized iconography. For example, consider the fact that the United States considers the founding fathers to be substantial icons, but also individuals like Rosa Parks and MLK, who are obviously quite disjoint ideologically from those individuals. And the reason that is possible is for the reasons Jordyn explains to you, in ways which uniquely unify those two communities that would not be possible in the world where we focused purely on ideology. That explains, I think, why we get substantially better unity under our side of the House, and importantly, more government faith insofar as you are electing a figure who is particularly popular, who has been relatively successful in defending the peace and restoring order to this country. And that's really important because we think that government faith in that individual, as opposed to in a guiding ideology, which is somewhat more abstract and disconnected to the events of that war or conflict, is really important for two two reasons. The first is that when you have faith in the government, you're much more willing to cooperate with it in really important ways. You actually believe in the legitimacy of an election and are willing to make your voice heard. You engage in public discourse to get policies discussed in front of the government to improve the nature of your country. And you're willing to pay tax so that the state actually has the capital to do things like engage in those forms of reform to create a functioning government. At the end of this debate, the most important thing was what drew people together to create the promise of a better future. And we explained to you that the reasons of flexibility, unity, and capacity, that is something which is only achieved by humans and their flexibility, not the rigid nature of ideology.
Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister, for that fine speech. I now welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Give me a second. I'll just organize my thoughts. Can I borrow your phone for the timer?
Yeah.
POIs through the chat. I'll probably take you maybe like after extraneous rebuttals. But I'll reserve that for whenever I'm ready for it. So I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. I need to make it evidently clear that although opening government may try to say that they have proven that they get better governance, there is no aspect or any mention as to how they actually get the governance that they want. All they say is that they get a better way of doing it, no incentives, no likelihoods, and no ability to do so. What I'm going to be doing is two things. The first is I'm going to be talking about why even in the worst case of opposition, where ideologies are not the best, I would argue that people are the worst thing to base your national identity off of. But the second thing I'm going to do is going to tell you why ideology is particularly a more uniting factor comparatively at the very end of the day. Two extraneous rebuttals before I go into anything. The first is they want to push one ideology on us, and fine, let's bite the bullet. Let's say, like, I don't know, we don't need to identify an ideology, right? But like maybe our ideology is democracy. Sure, there you go, capitalism, democracy, something like that. But like, I don't think that's particularly the most important thing to identify an ideology. I would argue that it's just the existence of choosing one at the very end of the day, particularly because we would argue that the vast majority of ideologies within this state are not that different or not that opposed to each other, right? So they try to say and they paint the picture of, oh, communists are going to fight against capitalists. Where is the, like, communists literally see capitalists as like evil and or like very bad individuals. And at the very end of the day, if that was true, then they probably wouldn't have been fighting together anyway. But even if that was true, that's exactly the point. Because there was already an existing ideology so bad, like, I feel like that's more of an extraneous point. So likely in the vast majority of cases, it's going to be many different ideologies, but a lot of these find a way to properly go about and find a way to be okay with each other. I would argue that's probably things like capitalism and socialism, but it's not going to be as extreme as two exactly opposing views. Let's box that out already, right? So be reasonable. The second thing I'm going to talk about is the idea of better governance. Because there's no incentive from opening government as to why they get better governance at all. They just say they do and they say they get that, but they never really mechanize it. But moreover, they never talk about why they get a better unifying thread more than just by saying, we have multiple individuals who represent these people, but particularly there's no incentive for these individuals at the top to continue to be with one another. But before I go into my extension, I'll take the POI from OG.
Yep. So in Syria right now, you have CIA-funded capitalist rebel groups, Islamic terrorists, and Kurdish nationalists, amongst a variety of other ideological groups. Imagine that they were able to successfully overthrow Assad. How would you choose one of those ideologies without immediately plunging the country back into conflict?
Yeah, so we refute that particularly because it's already an example. So we're not going to argue on that. But even then, we'll probably just look for the one that's most reasonable. Probably the one that has, democracy or is willing to go within the system. They're not all that different. I think there's a more extreme case. Don't credit that, Aj. So moving on, let's break the case of opening government and why they are more likely to create a very disparate and very dangerous state at the end of the day. So why does centering your national identity on people, why is it the most dangerous idea in this debate? Many of these would probably three structural reasons. The first is many of these individuals would still probably be alive. That means you create a cult of personality on individuals who are in power, in seats of position, and are generally continuously gaining power, like the USA post-revolution, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams. moreover, you arm extremely powerful people with generally opposing views sometimes, with a cult of personality saying that they represent the nation. This is extremely dangerous because, one, it causes polarization, because like they said, probably these people have different ideologies, and so now that they're fighting, right? But secondly, they're probably still armed. I would argue that when you buff these individuals up more than an ideology that's similar, what happens is they themselves become cocky. They probably generally just become much more polarized, because now they feel like they have a larger stake within this nation because they themselves have a larger amount of immunity. The second structural reason is that people have temporary life. Let's say two cases. One is that the leader dies and there's probably less unity because they fragment and divide. But secondly, they die and their children and their relatives are glorified and are seen as reflections of their parents. I think a good example of this would be like North Korea. But moreover, this creates a culture of nepotism and political dynasties within these places, which particularly makes it hard to A, properly practice democratic practices, and B, overthrow individuals who are properly complacent and are actually not helping individuals within these nations properly. What this does is it breaks democratic processes from actually being able to be done, and generally makes them much weaker on government side. The third structural reason then is the representative leaders are exactly that. They say that they are representative. Is it settling in as well? Because when you choose multiple different leaders who are representative of certain different individuals, is that they also have the individuals they're representing, right? So you might be the leader of an IP group, you might be the leader of, I don't know, an ideological group, but even then, because if there are clashes, what happens is these individuals have much more traction within the government and other things like that. So what this does is it uplifts a representative of the area. It does the same thing as the second, it glorifies them, or it creates a larger division at the very end of the day. The three conclusions, therefore, are: one, you make a much more volatile state; two, don't let OG run with extreme ideologies with unextreme people. It's just uncharitable. And three, there's a larger amount of autocracy, more than what OG wants to posit to you, because of the individuals entrenched within these places. But moreover, what then did Isa talk to you about? Because Isa talked to you about how we need stability here and now. I talked to you about how OG generally makes it more unstable, but what did Isa tell you? Isa told you two things why ideologies are particularly better. The first is that ideologies generally have a lot of similarities. When you actually agreed to fight with one another, there's probably not going to be that large of a divide. Let's be reasonable here. So at the very least now, these individuals are going to have a much more peaceful, and at the very least, the individuals are not entrenched in power. But the second, we would argue that ideas evolve over time. That is to say that the nation is not constrained by just these individuals and their ideals, but we would argue that they evolve with the nation overall. The constitution, which is made through these principles, through these ideologies, will be reflected for a longer time, and particularly it's not hard to try and reflect what the ideology wants from us. For all these reasons and more, we're very proud to oppose things.
Thank you very much, Deputy Leader of Opposition, for that fine speech. To extend the case on government, I welcome the Member of Government, Kehia.
Hello. Yeah. Starting. And 3. Oh,
Your
yes,
audio is
Oh,
Yeah, you're audible, but it's low. The volume's low.
sorry. Is this better?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. I'll take TY's through voice. Starting in 3, 2, and 1. The margin that occurs in opening is a little bit vague, with the opening deadlock being about which state is more stable, which state is more accountable. I'm going to very clearly frame as to why accountability or why stability of the state is not the a priori issue in this debate. And in that, we're going to extend by explaining why simply the resources are able to gather as that state when you have a leader as your national identity, makes it far easier for other countries to opt into you and negotiate with you in better deals. This will preclude any of the things that opening opposition wants to talk about, as well as the opening government material, because you can't like build any of your institutions, you can't build any like roads or like feed any of your people if simply don't have the resources to be able to do this. I want to be able to frame out the debate, but first I want to be able to make sure that opening opposition's claim on buy-in is just not standing in the ground. So opening opposition's main claim towards Gov is that there is no buy-in towards this leader because the leader is elitist, it is from the majority group. This is the main contention we hear come from the leader of opposition. I have two responses. The first response I want to launch is simply that this at best is not exclusive because firstly, like majorities will also want to like push their own ideology, but like so clearly like elitism is not like an a priori thing in the debate. But secondly, that leaders will still exist in opposition. Like you will still have to select a leader. So elitism still exists at worst under our side of the house. It's not exclusive. The second reason the second response I want to launch towards this is just to explain why leaders will be good. And I want to explain here that this is something that opening government kind of just asserts. Like opening government's reason that they launched from the DPM. It's just like, leaders care for some reason. But the reason why leaders will be good is simply because it's the ballot box, right? Like ethnic enclaves exist. They will have a race to the center because there's unique access to the vote, and you have to appease more people and cross the aisle in order to be able to make sure that you're the one who is in power. And that is the only reason as to why these people are likely going to be good. Not OG's reason of they just care, but that it is that even if they are selfish, that power requires you to cross the aisle in order for you to access it. So clearly the buy-in that exists under our side of the house is stable. Opening opposition cannot claim that it is not. The next question I want to ask here is just, what do ideologies look like? And here I want to deal with the COPOI. That's like, why can't you make ideology something like really cool and fluffy, like liberty and freedom? I think the main reason as to why you can't have a soft ideology is that national identity falls to extreme tensions, right? That is, look at the context of the nations that we're talking about in the debate. We're talking about nations, as opening government describes, that come from ethnic tensions, that come from ethnic conflict. So the context of the nation is that of several groups with huge tensions, with an extreme incentive to inflame each other if they are not able to agree with the person who is supposed to lead, which meant that insofar as you're just going to posit like some soft principle, it will obviously fall to other groups that will posit larger than life or like much larger in extent kinds of incentives or kinds of narratives against other groups. So the magnitude of the kinds of things they're positing has to be larger than that, which means that the kinds of ideologies on their side have to be extreme and have to be those that are very hard-fisted. That's exclusive because leadership and the selection of leaders itself is required, again, for you to cross the aisle. Sure, you might have to people might hate each other, but it is in the process of being able to make sure that you're a leader that does not manage a ruined country, that makes sure that these people have to have some concessions in the first place. You don't have that same level of, and this is the way, concreteness on their side of the house when it is just an abstract kind of ideology. The last thing that I want to point out is how this resolves the thing on accountability. The first thing to point out is at some point it resolves the stability on either side, right? Like there is no clear weighing from opening as to why this is not a birthing pain. Like opening governments just point on the comparative points out that it's something that might harm in the short term, which is that an ideology will take dominance once opening opposition's arguments kick in and people discuss ideology, or quite what we point out, that an ideology takes dominance, or on our side of the house, a leader will eventually take dominance once these people, as opening opposition points out, are able to scapegoat accountability. So the ability to have some accountability probably is not the margin of this debate. But the second to point out is opening opposition's reasons for why cults of personality exist are not exclusive, because people and leaders can also hijack ideologies. They will still be corrupt. They can probably do it to the same extent under their side of the house. So clearly the amount of accountability and making sure that these things can change probably isn't true for a fresh democracy that literally does not know what to do at all. Before I go on, I'll take before I go into the extension.
All right, so this is a new democracy. How will you ever clearly outline your constitution or agree on decisions without being guided by any specific principles?
Yeah, you guide it by the principle, but you don't make it the national identity. Like you do it in the process. It's not that you exalt as your main battle cry versus literally every other nation in the international community. We're talking about national identity. We're not talking about the creation of these constitutions. Our extension then is why is the international relations of these nations much better through investment and cooperation that other states are willing to give you. And the way I want to frame this contribution is just that the biggest problem in new democracies is the transition from autocracy. So you had a stable autocracy, or you had some kind of coexistence among groups until it blew up, which now means that now is the most time urgent to make sure that capital flight doesn't happen, to make sure that other kinds of investments don't just run away from you, because this is a democracy that is bound to fail if you don't have the resources resources that you need. There are two reasons as to why we are simply much better in ensuring more cooperation from other states and making sure that we have a safety net in case something goes wrong. The first thing is just that you have a signaling mechanism. So regardless of whether you are stable or not, it's that you are seen as more stable, right? Because the problem on their side is that it's not seen as stable if it's ideology because of the accessibility of the kinds of national identity that you posit. That is, it is difficult for foreigners to grasp what ideology or what national identity that you have, because the kinds of ideologies, as we point out, are simply very nascent and it's very messy because democracy is nascent. You have to go through a whole deliberative process to understand what kind of thing that you want to have from for your own national identity. So clearly the kind of identity that you probably have on their side is incredibly messy given that it's very new. Versus on our side of the house, it's very easy to access a leader after some kind of election period because it's just far more concrete, which means that you know that you can access this particular individual versus some like very vague national identity that exists in terms of like, that exists in terms of some ideology. The interim is very important because it's externally confusing. Sure, you might have a leader on their side of the house, but that's not the main banner that you expose to for the international community. It is your ideology, and that ideology is going to be messy, even if it might be dominant on their side of the house. The second reason as to why we have it better is simply you're seen as more controllable by bigger nations like US or China, right? So the bigger nations see that it's better or advantageous to make sure that they're allies with you, like because of some soft power bullshit, right? Firstly, because of the lack of information, that the only thing that they can see is there is a democracy with a leader, and that is their national identity, so it's very easy to access. But secondly, they have direct human interactions, so they understand that the broad national identity is far more easier to like penetrate because they know that like in order to penetrate this country, they just have to negotiate with this one leader that constitutes their own national identity. That points out that these individuals probably, like these individual countries, probably have a greater incentive to be able to deal with you or have a greater capacity to be able to deal with you. And that's important because a mediocre deal is better than no deal at all. The ability to get resources, the ability to get a safety net precludes your ability to keep your institutions stable. This comes prior to opening opposition and opening government, and that's why we win the debate.
Thank you very much, Member of Government, for that fine speech. I now welcome the Member of Opposition. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
Thank you so much, everyone, for rushing, by the way. It really helps, and I think the emergency will be okay. Anyway. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 observations to set up the win. Firstly, OO can't win because they don't talk about the counterfactual and they don't really talk about what leaders we really do want. They don't safeguard from the attacks of government and their own contradictory nature in which ideologies can also be as harmful by the own logic of OO. The second thing, CG has 2 problems. Firstly, the fact that I think their case is pretty far from the motion. Firstly, this is about identity building, not resource gathering or clout building with other countries. Yes, we know that you need to establish yourself in the international community, but you allocate different resources from nation building and that kind of stuff. But even if we were to take their general case that this is about having idols so that we can resource gather and also just have charismatic people for unity, we think it's very easy to make ideologies charismatic in a lot of ways. Like, sure, it's not a human being, but you often attribute more charismatic things to ideologies anyway. Like, for example, you can attach an object to it, like how justice and freedom is attributed to the eagle. You have the Statue of Liberty or Lady Justice, which is supposed to be blind, and it exemplifies a lot of complex ideologies if that's what you want. The third observation is finally engaging on OG. Look, OO was disingenuous to them. I get what they're trying to say. But the problem is that they're self-contradictory. First, they say that you can pick and choose the national identity. Look, you can't just say we can pick and choose if it's heroes and you can pick and choose if it's ideologies. You have the same fiat on both sides and you can spin whatever narrative. In fact, it's easier to fabricate things about an ideology. But if what that means is that if you're okay with whitewashing MLK to not really be about the things that they stood for, then you can whitewash communism and whitewash socialism. For example, there's references to socialism in Portugal's constitution and Germany's constitution, even though it is not a communist state. The CCP in China is the furthest thing from a communist state. Like, its economy is huge, but it has a very high nationalism, and of course, it has a lot of problems. Obviously, China has a bunch of problems, but it has high nationalism, which means that using the signal of the capitalism is good at inspiring a lot of this nationalism at the end of the day. The second thing, though, is if they say, well, ideologies of OG says ideologies have some certain technicalities that make it hard to really pick and choose when it comes to that. This also applies to national heroes, because let's ask the question, which no one else has. What were the problems in a nation democracy before they became a democracy to begin with? It's one of two things. Firstly, you have political families and parties who controlled the nation for so long, which means if you want to go to some kind of hero, they do have an alliance with current day people. It is unrealistic for opening opposition to say that these heroes are usually alive. No, they're usually not alive, but they have descendants in a lot of these cases, like the Philippines and these oligarchies, which will continue that kind of reign and make it so that you cannot be unproblematic when you choose a national hero. But secondly, if it is about the diametrically opposed parties, then who heroes will you choose at the end of the day? You will still choose someone who is either strongly aligned with communism, strongly aligned with democracy, and so you fall to your own responses. In the best case of government, if this is revolutionary heroes who are so far and meaningless to society nowadays, then the same response of OG applies here, that you cannot draw any meaning from these heroes because they're so removed from the current context. We basically muddle all of these things. Now that this whole characterization debate is out of there, we can get to actual arguments. The first thing that we want to talk about is that, okay, obviously we're already beating CG because we've told you why you get more riz, right? Like you have more charisma with an ideology. Why is it that leaders do not have this similar charisma at the end of the day, right? Opening government smooths this over by saying, well, we can whitewash it as much as possible. But the reality is nowadays, the truth always comes to light, right? Opening opposition is very imprecise. They say that heroes will be antagonized for killing people and finding. But in reality, these people are not hated for killing people and fighting because they did just wars. They're hated because of other parts of their character. George Washington was not fully fearless and patriotic because he wanted to be a strategist for the British at some point. He was an opportunist, right? OG says we just whitewash the heroes, just lie about the history. But this always gets heavily scrutinized by historians or opposition parties nowadays, right? Like woke young generations and opposition groups dig up the dirt on previous heroes, whether it's Lincoln, Jefferson, whoever, hero of the Democratic or Republican Party will always have dirt thrown on them. And it also gets harder to idolize these people because the morals of the time always evolve. Like, for example, like how womanizing of the presidents used to be common knowledge, but now obviously it's a big stink about it. Slavery, how non-political correctness even is making certain people like recent Republican politicians impossible to idealize. It is impossible for this generation gap to idolize these old generations, and that is why you have two problems. The first problem is that eventually you start thinking that the actual ideals of your nation are diluted, right? And if your nation was built on bad things or bad people, then the kind of politicians you'll be willing to compromise on nowadays are probably bad people. But more importantly, you have this generational gap. You have the gap in morals of people being divided by whether a certain historical figure is worth celebrating. You have less participation of the youth who grow more and more apolitical and become more and more opposed to this nation democracy. It'll probably not help it fill up the jobs that the youth needs to fill in these places. But secondly, comparatively, why is ideology so much better? Because it has no face and you can give it a random object that has charisma, it has two benefits. Firstly, the fact that it's perfect. It is an ideal that no one else could reach at the end of the day, but it still stands alone. And people in America still get so emotional about the idea of freedom, etc., even though no one embodied this truly, because the idea of that itself is something to strive towards and something that's inspiring, makes people want to work, makes people want to compromise on less important issues in this nation democracy and work together to rebuild. But secondly, it's the fact that these ideologies themselves can be changing because they are just vague and concrete enough to mean something, but vague enough to evolve over the years. It is not beholden to the problems like slavery or lack of inclusion in the past, because something like capitalism even can generally means freedom, etc. It also means the American dream. Like at the past, obviously, capitalism is a bad thing, but obviously the way that capitalism begins to embody other ideologies also makes it, things about the American dream, how you will welcome immigration and anyone who can contribute to the economy. It does become a beautiful thing eventually at the end of the day. But the last thing that we talked to you about, in the worst case, right, is if we do have to be decisive and choose a controversial ideology, why is that a good thing? Because we'll be the first team to take the burden that you need to be decisive in a nation democracy. Sure, there was fighting in the past, but you need to somehow get people to agree on something, right? If people do not like a certain certain ideology because it didn't work in the past, you can at least tell that it is different from the most recent problem that you have, right? So if some people hate communism because of how in the past it was a bad thing, at least it's better than the last, like the very last problem that came around, right? And you can redefine that within the bounds of democracy and be really great with it. But the second thing is that at least you have a way forward, right? Things are new, things are clear, which is the very uncertainty that was the problem in past of nation democracies. The fact that in nation democracies, you were just changing hands between political families. There was no system. It was personality politics and corruption. At least now people think that there's a system of what's happening, something they can believe in, something they can subscribe to. We've rebutted all the teams already, and we've given you a horizontal extension, winning the vertical debate. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Member of Opposition, for that fine speech. To end the case for government, I welcome the government whip. Here.
You're unmuted. Hi, I'm Neil. Your eyes to voice, please. Yeah, pronounce your EM. I'll try answering one. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Unlike the ideal world that opposition wants to push for, ideologies are also written in blood and can be used for harm just as much as Op wants to say that leaders hurt people. It's quite telling that Op cannot find a single ideology to use as an example that can work with democracy that is strong enough to actually unite people together. Just one clarification to start off this speech. 1, will culture personality exist on either side of the house? We think yes. So this also is kind of also response to OO. Because OO's reasons for why culture personality exists are not exclusive. People can also hijack ideologies. Look at Mao Zedong. Look at Deng Xiaoping. Look at Xi Jinping. There are people who are able to hijack these ideologies, and those ideologies can then be used for harm in the future. So there, culture personality can exist on either side. So what happens then is we have to evaluate it based on how good these leaders are going to be, which I'll have to approve later. A few things I want to talk about in this speech. The first thing I want to do is take out CO. Next thing I want to do is talk about long-term development. And next, I'll talk about life in this new democracy. First, I'll talk about CO. They say they talk about identity. We think identity is also important. But the thing is, we think that identity is incredibly important because it allows you to have good optics. And we think you're able to exclusively get that insofar as you're able to have a leader, an actual face that you can attach the country towards. So, because if you have a good reputation, that allows you to have good optics, that allows Western nations to be able to interact with you. And we think that's incredibly crucial, as David points out. I'm not sure why CO said it, it's not an issue. It's a very, very important issue when it comes to the transitions, when it comes to these democracies. Nations are smart. They can't actually be rizzed up by just some smooth talking guys, like as CO wants to claim. These people want to see that there is actual real stability within the nation, and that's what feeds into the issue that I want to talk about later. I want to talk about why you cannot have a good ideology which takes on the vast majority of CO. Because no, ideologies are messy, and this was unresponded to by MO, because we point out a nascent democracy is made up of many, many different political parties and ideologies, which mean that it is a very long deliberative process to find out what ideology you want to make the entire nation subscribe to, compared to, for example, a revolutionary. So while other people might have different reasons as to why they wanted the country to become independent, the fact is that person made that country independent, and therefore that person is at the very least marginally more agreeable to become the face of the nation compared to an ideology which has to be deliberated upon and will likely take a very, very long time. But I want to note also, this is inherent, it's also inherent. But just note, the example of China and ideologies, right? Like China literally just about worships the grand premier every time, right? Like Mao is on the Yen bill, you have Deng Xiaoping, Xi Jinping. And the reason for that is that it's incredibly hard to unite a nation with just an abstract notion of communism, right? Because you know why? It's hard for your average person to just understand that. So that means that they have to ascribe a face to that person. So that's just a concession that you have to have some sort of face. And we think you're able to have that face, but also have a better person in the first place on our side of the house. So that takes up the vast majority of CO. We think that ideologies are incredibly messy. It's hard to even figure out what ideology to go for, and therefore you won't be able to rizz up any nations to give you development aid. Next thing I want to talk about is long-term development. And it was incredibly important from David because it's the ability for the new democracy to interact with the Western nations, like developed nations. So even if OG proves a short-term ability, maybe they can have that.
to get stability, what the most important value of this debate is being able to have long-term stability. Because insofar as you do not have long-term stability, that new democracy will just be ruled over by another strong man. You have democracy like backsliding, and we think that's really, really bad. I think everyone else in this debate can agree that that's bad. So we think it helps with investment, right? And what did David say? That it's easier for Western nations to deal with leaders rather than ideologies. So we can get them to shift stances on some policies. Maybe you can get the leader to bend over. And that's what Western nations want. They want control, right? So sure, we might become some puppet or be beholden to the West for a few years. But that is it. There are a lot worse fates to happen to nations in the past, right? So note what an ideologically bound state looks like. And this is me taking down the vast majority of OO implicitly. Because note, on their side of the house, they're largely closed off. The ideologies are dramatically opposed to other ideologies, given the fact that, as CO points out, ideologies by design are supposed to be perfect. So any other ideology is likely to be false, right? So that means that therefore on op, you lose access to a lot of trading partners. You're seen as far more like holier than thou. You're seen as like it's far more likely for you to just ascribe to some sort of like principle or like or whatever compared to like actually dealing with the pragmatics at hand, which is far more likely when you have like a blank slate leader, right? So it's also much less controllable or agreeable by to the West. So that means that the West feels like they won't be able to control you, which means they're also much more apprehensive to talk to you. And like trade with you, and we think that's really, really, really bad. So note that this is inherent to the motion. The fact is that without international help and intervention, democracies will backslide. So at the end of this issue, OO is out. Their ideology locks them out of a lot of trade because of the fact that the West doesn't feel comfortable with them. That's the reason why China, for example, is suddenly buddy with a lot of like suddenly buddy with the West, because like China suddenly isn't communist, right? They ascribe it towards a leader, like for example Xi Jinping, and we think that's what helps the West be a lot more comfortable when dealing with them. So that's dealt with. I want to talk about the life in this new democracy also. So what gets more people to opt into this new democracy in the first place? And I think it's really, really important because I want to talk about some other stuff that like openly didn't want to talk about. The problems with ideology is that they have to be strong in order for people to unite them. And we point out from David, just completely unresponded. It's also just far more agreeable to have a revolutionary leader lead the nation. Because sure, a revolutionary leader might have taken some grain from a few villages, but there are some ideologies which have killed millions upon millions of people, and it is incredibly unlikely that you're going to be able to like get the people rallied together towards that strong ideology, which is just like you just get back to weak ideologies that people don't really feel a strong like relationship towards, right? But also note that ideologies can be vilified the same as people. That's why post-communist state populations in Ukraine or Poland hate communism, because their friends, their family were killed in the name of ideology. What this means for the debate is that all points on ideologies being agreeable is just factually wrong. Because in order for an ideology to be strong enough, it needs to have strong enough beliefs. And sometimes those strong enough beliefs lead to a lot of people dying, which leads the population to have negative feelings towards that ideology. Therefore, what does stand is David's analysis. What they pointed out is that sure, even taking CO on face, maybe some leaders don't have anything going for them, like Gandhi or whatever. But that's good because they are a blank slate, which means that they can push for absolute good policies. We've proven likelihood from David. Like generally, like they're good people, like for example, like Washington, for example, right? But also just even if they're not, the fact that they're good, like the fact that you have a ballot box means that these people are going to be far more agreeable because people actually voted for them. So therefore, you can have a blank slate leader on our side of the house who is generally agreeable to most sects of society and is going to be able to help the vast more amounts of people. Because not only do we actually help like reach us, make this country like help the international community, but also just make him far more agreeable, far incredibly proud to propose. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Government Whip, for that fine speech. To end this debate, I welcome the opposition whip. Here.
Okay. Chat, please.
I can hear you, but the volume is still a bit low.
Oh yeah, because I was speaking softly.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Chat, please. Sorry. 3, 2, 1, let's go. The concept of an ideology is not just one that lives forever. It is one that allows people to imagine what that ideology means for them. While we cannot bend the values and the personhood of an individual or an idol, we can identify what being part of a nation and nation building process means to us through that ideology. What I'm first going to do at WIP is talk about RIV's extension and why it beats everyone else in the round. The first thing is that it beats government bench precisely because while a lot of government benches impacts are concentrated on benefits that are only acquired when the leader is alive, things like, for example, resource gathering, being able to communicate with other communities or other nations, and that's all in good, we argue that our impacts of political dynasties, biased voter bases, skewed history, the long-term effects, for example, of deciding at this very pivotal moment who will decide what your nation is going to look like in history books and the way that you teach it to future generations is one that affects nations and new democracies for centuries to come and determines the political climate that they will suffer or endure for years to come. The reason then why we beat opening opposition is while they explain, for example, that this gives rise to familial dynasties, to a lot of bad things that erode democracy, we fill in the gaps that serve as a prerequisite in order to believe that value, which is how do these people rise into power as a result of defining them as the, figurehead of nation building, or for example, directly explain how it jeopardizes the ideal process of nation building that comes from opening government and closing government. What I'm first going to do is explain why closing government is out of this debate. The first thing they say is that a national identity should be done through a figure. The first thing I want to rebut is this assumption that we need a specific individual because of stability. The first thing is that a lot of the nation building that occurs transpires precisely because people are in communities that are inspired by ideologies like the freedom and the courage and the bravery and the valor that Riv talks about in his speech is just made fun of and sidestepped at closing government as a North Star to be able to believe that we should rebuild our houses and find a better tomorrow. But even if you don't believe that ideologies are that pivotal in doing that, the general value of not wanting to starve, not wanting to be hungry, not wanting to go back to the destitute life of living under conflict zone is precisely what will motivate people to still build their communities either way. So that value isn't really exclusive, nor is it valuable on opening government and closing government. Opening government and closing government have this shared assumption that just because you are running yourself on a nation identity built on an ideology, there's no rebuilding that happens. But there are communities, there are grassroots movements, there are opposition teams that are actively trying to go through the process of setting up home shelters, feeding the needy, restructuring democratic processes, that it is unclear to me as to whether or not nothing will actually happen on opposition world. The second thing they say is on safety nets and capital flight. This assumes that the idol or the figure in question gives the perception of stability, which is again the prerequisite of the argument. But there are many reasons to believe why this isn't always the case. The first reason is because often, especially if you believe the opening government and closing government shared frame that they should have clear values, that they're strong in their values in order to lead the country, they are often polarizing figures that not everyone will agree with. The second reason is because they often have high militarization, because they have the monopoly on security and political power that allow them to win the vacuum and become the new figurehead or the new revolutionary of that specific new democracy. And therefore, what I want to do at the second level of this discussion is to discuss and address the long-term development argument coming from member of government. Let's whip this debate back into shape. When they say that you can achieve stability and you want to avoid backsliding, that is largely asserted at the midway of government whip. Look at the fact of cults of persona. And surprisingly enough, for a room full of Filipinos, no one bothers to recognize that it is things like valorizing the Aquinos, valorizing the Yellow Movement, the EDSA people power that precisely resulted in the cults of personality that resulted in the democratic backsliding, because we put all of our eggs in the basket of one family, one face, one individual, which resulted in people becoming severely angry at that one individual when the natural consequences of living and suffering occurs that allowed the rise for other people that also created valorization and also created the cult of persona, i.e. the Marcoses, to come into power. The final thing I want to talk about is on revolutionary leaders. We're wasting our time trying to measure how many idols have killed versus ideologies have killed. But structurally, what comes from Riv is the explanation that the apathy that comes from valorizing someone, romanticizing someone, precisely because they are an idol or a figurehead, is precisely what makes you feel like you aren't a good citizen. And the importance that brings towards the context of a new democracy is precisely because that is the prerequisite for people to believe that they can wake up every day and rebuild their nation, set up the houses, rebuild the democratic structures, feed people in soup kitchens, and other things like that. And we precisely think that it is precisely to ideologies on the courage, on the bravery, or capitalism or communism, whatever you want, that makes people believe that something is worth living and allows people to wake up at the end of the day. Before I proceed to discussing opening government, closing government, go ahead.
So our extension was not dependent on actual stability. It was the signal and the perception of stability versus you having messy and extreme ideologies that take way too long to resolve.
So the responses still apply if people see that you came from a militarized background, or they see that you're polarized because they don't align with the specific ideology that your specific figurehead represents. The impacts still apply. Opening government. First thing they say is on being able to pick and choose. The first thing we say is that untrue, you can have different sectors. For example, in the Philippines, where politicians heavily integrate religion into their politics, they often have verifying degrees on how they exercise their Muslim faith or their Catholic faith, for example. Second of all, even if the propensity of radicalism is much more likely, wherein ideologies are centered around good values like courage, valor, compassion, individuals often come from radicalism and want to outcompete other potential leaders and other potential idols and figureheads. But third, even in extreme ideologies, let's say like Bangladesh, and nothing bad happens, perhaps this is fine in economically and democratically secure countries, but precisely this debate is about post-war states and got ones that came from atrocities, wherein a lot of them are more vulnerable because there's a period when you're writing history, there are a lot of power vacuums, wherein after that interim period where you're no longer a new democracy, how do you exit out of that autocracy and lead into a real democracy wherein you have people engaging with different ideologies and different kinds of individuals? This fourth thing I want to note is there is a comparison between how individuals compete as idols versus how ideologies compete. Or in individuals, as Riv defines exclusively in extension, you could become content on what that ideology specifically means for you within the bound of that concept, versus idols, wherein they have a means to create cults of persona, dictate violence, inspire people to be the most heinous and messy that they can be. And therefore, what this means is that on their world, while it is possible for them to have some form of nation building, it is severely more risky, severely more difficult, severely less likely to mitigate in comparison to ideologies wherein if you want to believe that it is unclear, then you also have to believe that it is significantly safer.
Thank you very much, opposition.